You're all very quiet. You're all very quiet. You can hear me without the microphone now, but we'll just a second until we figure that out. Is it on? Wonderful. Good evening and welcome to the Charleston Library Society. I am Polly Buxton of Buxton Books. I have the privilege with my husband, Julian, of having an independent bookstore right here on campus. The Charleston Library Society invited us a few years ago to move our little pop-up bookshop right here to 160 King Street. So I see some of you who have been so dear and supportive, and we thank you. And those of you who haven't been in the bookshop, please come see us. We are grateful every day for the privilege of being able to be connected to the Charleston Library Society, to host and co-host evenings like this tonight. This one has been a little while coming. As some of you know, this was rescheduled, so we're so glad that we're a little bit smaller crowd than we had originally had, but we're so glad that you were able to come during this week of gratitude. And Margaret Burnham, we are so grateful that you were here today, and thank you for this book. You know that I can't stand up here without talking a little bit about the ecosystem of publishing and books, so bear with me because I know you know it. But we couldn't do, when Norton reached out to us and asked us to host and co-host this with the Charleston Library Society, we were so honored. She was going to be here during pub month, during those first pub weeks, and we weren't able to. We're all used to that now, that things have to be rescheduled to keep everyone healthy and safe. But it's the fact that we can have these books, an author like Margaret Burnham here during pub month, is really an extraordinary thing. We want that. Charleston deserves that. By showing up tonight, by buying a book either tonight or later from the bookstore, we report those numbers. We let the publishers in New York know that they can and should be sending their authors here. Authors of this caliber, sharing previously untold story, extraordinary amounts of research, and it truly is a privilege. By being here tonight, if you so choose to buy a book, that's the way that you help curate our community. We get to host more events like this with the Charleston Library Society and foster conversation and change and knowledge. So thank you for being here. And I'm going to read all about Margaret Burnham to let you know. Oh, there he is. Judge Gergel has walked in, and I am going to preface this. We found out, Judge Gergel, that you already know Margaret Burnham, that you were on a panel together with Patricia Sullivan, and we're not surprised about that. But Judge Gergel and Belinda Gergel are very dear to me, and Laura Mina, she's the head librarian here, Margaret Burnham, and she invited me to be Judge Gergel's bookseller. It was the first major collaboration where we were really becoming the booksellers for the Charleston Library Society as a reporting store. And your book, Unexampled Courage, any of you who read that, if you haven't, you should. If heard him speak, saw the PBS show, it is about the unexampled courage, the blinding of Sergeant Isaac Woodard. It's an extraordinary story, and when I read the advanced reading copy on the plane, I'm not sure that I was a good advocate for the book because I was making almost animal sounds, crying. And so people are like, whatever she's reading, I don't want to read that. But it was, I had to keep stopping, and that first section of the book, there are 3 sections of the book. Once you get through the first section, it just powerfully takes you on a journey of awakening and change, and it's just really a very special story. But it is also the reason I am referencing it and why you are here tonight and why you were on that panel together is by hands now known, Jim Crow's legal executioners. Unexampled Courage was my personal first dive into that subject matter, and it was difficult, and but most worthwhile things are. So thank you for the book Unexampled Courage and bringing that story. And now back to by hands now known. Jim Crow's legal executioners. Margaret Burnham is the founding director of the Civil Rights and Restorative Justice Project at Northeastern University. She has been a staffer for the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, a civil rights lawyer, a defense attorney, and a judge. A professor of law, she was nominated by President Biden and confirmed by the U.S. Senate to serve on the Civil Rights Cold Case Records Review Board. I hope we're going to hear a little more about that tonight as well. She lives in Boston, Massachusetts. She had a starred Kirkus Review and is also a finalist for the 2022 Kirkus Prize for Nonfiction. By Hands Now Known is one of the Chicago Public Library's best books of 2022. And the September New York Times Review, which Margaret Burnham was telling us was not critical enough. So so don't be afraid to ask her a hard question or a challenging question, because she said, but that review, I have to say, as a bookseller, I liked it because it really helped sell a lot of books. It brought lots of attention. By Hands Now Known, the chronic, unpredictable violence that shaped daily life in the South. Recounting such stories is part of the important work that this book does. But historical retrieval is only part of Burnham's goal with this book, which picks up where law has failed. With justice so elusive, even a simple acknowledgement of the facts is a necessary step. As some of the survivors put it when they first heard from Burnham and her team, I thought I'd never get this call. Powerful. Please join me in welcoming Professor Margaret Burnham. Silence your phones if you haven't already. I didn't read, the bookseller didn't read. I was supposed to tell you that earlier on. Thank you.
Thank you, Polly. Thank you so much, Polly, for that really warm and generous introduction. And I don't think this works. Is it working? Yeah? Good. Thrilled to be in another historic city. I'm from Boston. We have the Boston Athenaeum in our city, and this seems as if it's a sister library to the Athenaeum. And I am so thrilled to be talking about this book, which is, I'm not a trained historian, but it is about history in a city that so lives its history, so is inspired by its history, and so takes its history so seriously. So by Hands Now Known, and I'm also absolutely thrilled to be here with Judge Burgo again, and to be joined in conversation about our two books, which deal with the law and the way the Jim Crow regime affected and transformed our law and still influences the law. So this book is an historical account of three interwoven themes. I am discussing violence, the experience of racial violence during a particular period of time. And here I'm particularly focused on anti-Black violence, but obviously some of these themes can be applied to other forms of violence in our country. I'm also interested in the role of the federal government, both the federal courts and for the period I'm talking about, World War II era, 1940s, the role of the War Department in controlling the violence, in using federal law to affect and to diminish, where possible, the violence. And finally, I'm talking about the forms of resistance that were prevalent during this period of time. Now, we know, obviously, that racial violence has been a factor in our country, has defined our country for a long period of time, continues to plague our lives today, and that resistance has been a sort of a counterforce to that violence. But the resistance takes particular forms during particular moments in history. And so here I'm looking at the resistance across communities, both white and African American communities. The work focuses in the South, So I'm looking at the Confederate States, and I'm looking at the period from 1930 to 1954, very specific period of time. I took on this project because in 2007, our then President Bush signed a bill called the Emmett Till Cold Case Act. The purpose of the Emmett Till Act was to take a look at cases from the civil rights era, the more traditional civil rights era, classic civil rights period, 1954 to 1967, and determine whether any of those cases could be reopened and perhaps re-prosecuted. The Emmett Till initiative was not entirely successful. Ultimately, the government collected 150 cases that it thought should be re-examined, but of those cases, only one was ultimately prosecuted. So I began thinking about the Emmett Till Act and what we could do as lawyers and law students to work with the families and to work with the federal government to make this initiative successful. But it quickly became apparent to me that there was a period of time that would not be touched by the Emmett Till Act because all of the perpetrators in these cases, in these earlier cases, the cases like the Isaac Woodard case, that is the subject of Unexampled Courage, were not available anymore. They died. They passed on. But as Polly suggests, once we began calling the family members who were affected by this violence, they were eager, indeed deeply anxious, to be involved in our efforts to not to solve the cases, but to examine them, to explore them, and to think about what, if any, meaning they had for us today. As Polly suggested, we call them and they'd say, look, we've been stewing with this material for a really long time. We don't have the federal documents that would help us figure out what actually the federal government knew about these events. We don't have the state documents. They did have their own material. They had letters that they'd collected. So as we went around the country, people would show us material that they had, sort of vernacular collections that local communities and families had kept up. And so together, we made a partnership with them. We were able to wrangle down the Freedom of Information Act and get federal documents that were unavailable to these communities and families. They were able to bring us their memories, their stories, their photographs, and together we were able to create a full account of what had actually transpired. Ultimately, folks, we ended up with 1,000 cases from that period, 1930 to 1954, all of which we've now collected and made public in an archive called the CRRJ Archive. So crrjarchive.org. It includes all of the documents, including the Woodard case, that are now in one place. No one has to deal with the FOIA anymore. They're all out there, and they're available for communities to explore. So this work is obviously historically situated. It grows out of new examinations of the Jim Crow period, not just the Woodard case and the Woodard book, but the John Hope Franklin Center at Duke University recently published an archive and a series of books called Behind the Veil, which is about what life was like during the Jim Crow era across our country. Two sociologists, Stuart Tolnay and E.M. Beck, also wrote a book in 1995 called Festival of Violence, which reviewed cases that they had collected about lynching. Now, my book is not about lynching. It's about cases where individuals were killed by police or by individuals outside of the lynching arena, as it were. But the Tolnay and Beck book then generated a good deal of scholarship, additional scholarship, on the question of violence in the South. And then most of us are aware of the work done by the Equal Justice Initiative with the museum down in Montgomery, Alabama, And then in 2009, a journalist by the name of Douglas Blackman published a really Pulitzer Prize-winning book called Slavery by Another Name that looks at work and slavery situated, in that case, in Alabama. So there is renewed interest. We've moved away. I think we have. One never exhausts the subject, but to the extent that one could be exhausted, certainly we've exhausted our exploration of the formal Jim Crow era, 1954 to 1967. There are so many books out there, so much scholarship out there about that period. But we're now, and it's really because of the historic significance of that period that these earlier years, the years of the 1930s, which were years of enormous struggle in our country around the labor unions, and indeed going into the 1940s, have pretty much been not fully explored by scholars. And so I got into this arena with a view towards filling that gap in some way. And so what I discover, first of all, and the stories that I tell in the book, are carry the Woodard story to the next level. They're about the ordinariness, the mundaneness, the quality, everyday quality of the kind of violence that Jim Crow generated and that was essential to maintaining Jim Crow during these years. I begin my book with a story of a woman by the name of Ollie Hunter. She lives in a very small town in Georgia. The year is 1942, perhaps 1943. Ollie Hunter is a middle-aged African-American woman who goes into a store in Donaldsonville, Georgia. She picks up a can. Many of you probably remember these old, Main Street, little small street. There's a Main Street and then there's a back street. She's on Main Street. She goes into the store. She picks up a can of oil and puts it down in some way that seems to have upset the store owner, who's a young man, 21-year-old white man, who then follows her out of the store and beats her to death with an axe. That case, and the reason I start with that case is because the case disappears. Unlike the Isaac Woodard case, where Isaac Woodard blinded but lives, this woman is killed. And there is one record about her case, now two because we found her death certificate. But one record remained about her case, which was a letter written to the NAACP by a man. We don't know his race. I don't even know if he's a man. I don't know his race or his gender. He writes a letter to the NAACP in New York City, and he says, this horrible thing happened in my town. I don't think any justice will ensue from the death of this woman. And indeed, we then conducted a very thorough investigation of records in Donaldsonville, found nothing. The young man, it appears from all we've been able to gather, quickly sent away to join the war effort. So I begin that, it exemplifies, it's extreme, but it also exemplifies the kind of invisibility and also ordinariness of the violence of this period. And, so why are we looking at it? Well, I look at it because I want to understand what that does to a legal system. When you have a legal system that is unable to protect people from that sort of violence, first of all, two things. How did the legal system get to that point? And what, if any, lasting consequences are there for a legal system that is unable to protect folks from that kind of inescapable violence? And what I say in the book, I traced in the book, and this is probably perhaps the most boring part of the book, is the laws that were adopted during the Jim Crow era to address racial violence. This is, not during the Jim Crow era, during Reconstruction. Right after Reconstruction, two federal laws were adopted that were directed to Klan violence. Those laws lay fallow until not the 1940s. Indeed, the Justice Department that did not even begin to focus on racial violence until 1939, when it created a unit. Have in mind, folks, the height of the lynching era, which is the 1910s and 1920s. Nothing's going on. There are no prosecutions. There is no legislation. That we well know. But the laws which were designed, federal laws which were designed to tamp down on this sort of thing, are completely useless to that task. And in 1939, the Justice Department establishes a special unit called the Civil Rights Unit, headed by Frank Murphy, a Michigan politician who ultimately would become a Supreme Court justice. And he gets going and immediately seeks to try to bring some order to this reality in these small southern cities, unsuccessfully. And so I tell the story not just of the laws, but of also of the ways in which, notwithstanding the best efforts of federal authorities, the violence continues, remains unaddressed. The book begins with a chapter on rendition. And rendition is the process, for those of you who are not schooled in the law, by which one state seeks to bring back its citizen from a state to which that citizen has escaped or run away. And I argue in the book that the rendition landscape really borrows from pre-Civil War cases in which runaway slaves left the South and ended up in northern sanctuary states. And what I say is that some of the tools, both the practical tools as well as the pathways and the legal tools that were developed during the early 19th century pre-Civil War era are lifted up again during the early 20th century, when folks are running away from violence which they know will, were they to remain, end in their death. One of the cases, and I try to focus this story by developing the history of resistance in a particular northern community, and here I look at Detroit. The way in which the legal community in Detroit, both white and black lawyers in Detroit, come together and develop real, deep, sophisticated expertise so as to help these folks who are running from the South. And I tell three stories. The last story that I tell is out of Mississippi, a man who was accused in early 1930s, 1931, with killing a police officer on a street in an incident on a street, not Mississippi, New Orleans, killing a man on the street in New Orleans, goes up to Detroit, becomes a Ford worker, and is ultimately 10 years later fingered by someone, and New Orleans wants him back. A long fight ensues. The man says, "I won't live a day if I get returned to New Orleans." Indeed, in that case, he loses his extradition battle, goes back to New Orleans. We're now in 1941, and he doesn't have not a moment in court, not a moment in a police station. Once the police bring him back to New Orleans, they take him out on a road in New Orleans called Airline Road, and they shoot and they kill him. And those were the stakes. They were that high for these folks. And so I tell that story because I think it links well with the earlier pre-Civil War era, but also it describes the ways in which the legal community begins to develop ties, one community to another, and also how the receiving communities, which are which are empowered, which have more authority, more power, receiving African American communities, they vote. They could vote Frank Murphy into a mayorship or out of a mayorship, right? That's not true in the South. And so they are using this political authority and political power in order to protect these folks and to build an international, and to build a national African American community. Isaac Woodard is one of many. He was a veteran, but one of many soldiers and veterans who traveled Jim Crow and who were assaulted and in some cases died as a result of their resistance to Jim Crow. And here I have a chapter in the book on what it was like for these folks to resist, which is essentially what they did. If they walked past a bus driver who ordered them to the back of the bus, they would refuse to sit in the back of the bus, and many paid for their lives with that. And one of the stories I tell is of a man by the name of Booker Spicely. Booker Spicely is a soldier in Camp Butner, which is near Durham, North Carolina. And Spicely is out on a Saturday night visiting a little neighborhood in Durham, African-American neighborhood called Haiti, and, having a nice time, gets back on the bus, gets ready to go back to his base, and is told by the bus driver that he needs to get, a white soldier gets on, same uniforms, same U.S. Army, and Spicely is told to go to the back of the bus and make room for this white soldier. He protests, and he says, look, I'm from Philadelphia. We don't do that kind of thing in Philadelphia. And, continues to give lip, presumably, to the bus driver, put yourself in those shoes. And at a certain point, he realizes, I may have gone too far. And so as he gets off the bus, the private says to the bus driver, I'm sorry if I offended you. Well, it was too late. The bus driver follows him off the bus and shoots and kills him, leaves him lying in the gutter in IAT, Durham, North Carolina, keeps driving and finishes his route. In that case, the NAACP gets involved. Thurgood Marshall brings in lawyers, all for naught. The case is tried. The bus driver is acquitted. That case was not discovered until, I shouldn't say discovered, was not lifted up, was not included in our national archive, was not included in our knowledge about World War II until, I'm bragging a bit, our students picked it up and started writing about it. And now there's a really robust group of lawyers and civic leaders in Durham who are trying to reincorporate the Spicely case in the history of Durham. And they've gone back in Durham, the bus company was run by this private company, Duke Power, ran the bus company. And our student from Boston wrote to Duke Power and said, can you do anything for Spicely, for the Spicely family? Of course, we didn't, student up from Boston, law student in Boston, we got no response. But once these local folk got involved, and, obviously they know people, Duke Power has now agreed to set up a scholarship fund. It's just one case. It's one of many cases. But it's a case that matters not just to the family, but to that community. It matters for everybody who had some role or some place in observing what transpired with Spicely. Let me just say further on the Spicely case. As I said, I'm looking at the violence, I'm looking at the resistance, and I'm also looking at the role of the federal government. And in the Spicely case, the Army sent an investigator, the 5th Division of the Army, which was then headquartered in Columbus, Georgia, sent an investigator, undercover investigator, to Durham to follow up on Spicely. But the investigator did nothing to discover the facts of Spicely's death. Rather, the investigator, and this we know because we've looked at the War Department records, spent all of his time making sure that there would be no protest from the African American community. He goes from bar to bar and church to church, checking on the temperature of the African American community to make sure that there's nothing that would disrupt the reputation of the Army or cause trouble for Camp Butner. And we see that over and over again. That's not to say that was always the response of the Army. I'm not saying that. But I'm saying it was too often the response of the Army, that our job here is to contain, not to protect, but to contain. One of the other files that I found as I did this research was a file offered to me, generously offered to me by one of the archivists at NARA, our National Archives at College Park in Maryland. And the file was labeled the Negro Transportation File. And this too comes out of the 5th Division of the Army, Columbus. And so there was trouble with the buses. Isaac would an example, vet, but there was trouble with getting folks from place to place, places they needed to be in order to provide all the services that we needed to fight an effective war, fight effectively in the war. And so the Army was concerned about what was going on in the buses, but what it did, again, was to initiate a containment policy, which involved having the bus supervisors from various cities across the South in the 5th District, Mobile, Alabama, Montgomery, Alabama, Jackson, Mississippi, report to the Army if there was any trouble going on in the buses. All right. So, so there is a chapter about soldiers, and I include in this chapter a story of a man who was not a soldier. His name is Edwin Williams, and the time is 1943, and the place is Algiers, Louisiana. Algiers, you may know, is right across the river from New Orleans, sits on Mississippi River. It's part of Orleans Parish. I'd like to begin by just reading a little bit of what I wrote about Edwin Williams, and then I'll try to finish the story. When she was not working as a nurse's aide, or cleaning, when she was not working as a nurse's aide or cleaning other women's homes, Lillian Williams, née Alvarez, sold snowballs to her neighbors in New Orleans. In 2012, at 99 years of age, she passed away. At the beautiful Zion Baptist Church in Algiers, a long line gathered in front of the pulpit to extol her virtues and accomplishments, among them providing for her 5 sons whose well-being depended in some small measure on the accumulation of small coins from snowballs. At her funeral, her son James eulogized Lillian Williams, for he was the pastor at beautiful Zion Baptist, the church where Lillian and her husband Edwin Williams had worshiped, and where in 1943 Edwin's funeral was held. At Edwin's funeral as well, 69 years before Lillian's, mourners filled the pews and spilled over into the aisles. They praised the deceased and then walked quietly to the front pew to comfort the young widow and her fatherless sons, of whom at the time there were 4. Maybe Edwin Williams' brothers, 2 tenors in the New Orleans Gibbs Quartet, sang the group's most well-known song, "Guide Me, O Thou Great Jehovah." A local newspaper reported that ministers from churches across the city were in attendance, as were the deceased's friends, quote unquote, white and colored. Somewhere within her body, Lillian Williams buried for 69 years, and took to her grave the calamity of Edwin's murder. Only rarely did she talk to her sons about it. She never shared it with her congregation, although some of the older parishioners would have remembered the well-publicized event. What lay beneath the years of silence she placed in divine hands, and there perhaps she thought it should remain, unresolved, unexplained, and unexplored. A personal burden, she did not register her story in the archive of African American sorrow. She neither passed it down to her sons and their children as a cautionary tale about the perils of whiteness, nor did she offer it up as an inscription on the Williams totem pole. All that Lillian Williams left for others to do. On her mantelpiece, she placed a photograph of Edwin and moved on with a life that was at once pious and plenteous. She took in a brother's child, adding another son to the four she and Edwin had together. To her neighbors who loved her snowballs, she would come to be known as the Cold Cup Lady. To her grandsons, she was the best red beans cook in New Orleans and a ruthless Chinese checkers player. She sang in the church choir, as had her husband for 10 years, and served as senior deaconess at beautiful Zion Baptist. She stayed put in the home where she and Edwin had begun their family, only a short walk from the church and from the place where he was slain. She was grateful for the support of her family, especially her brothers-in-law, who took a keen interest in their nephews, tutoring them in the gospel music that nourished the Williams clan and knit it together from one generation to the next. That's the story of, excuse me, Lillian, who, as I say, died in 2012. In 1943, she was walking home from church on a Wednesday with her husband and their two small children when three sailors in their 20s, coming presumably from New Orleans back to Algiers, where there was a Coast Guard base, saw the couple and threw beer down on Lillian Williams and her baby. Edwin Williams, her husband, protested, and what ensued was a fight. The men came down from the viaduct where they were walking, the three soldiers, and they stabbed him to death with a beer bottle in front of his wife and his two small children. Lillian Williams had the presence of mind the very next day to go into New Orleans to the NAACP office and to fill out or to sit for an affidavit which told this whole story of what had transpired. The only way the sailors were identified, was one of them left a hat behind, and they were able to go to the Coast Guard station and identify them. They were tried, all three of them. I'm sorry, let me get this straight. One of them was tried, and the other two testified in his favor, and he was acquitted and sent off by the Coast Guard abroad to continue fighting. He came back and lived the rest of his days in Bexar, Texas. No one ever knew about this picadillo from his youth. We're all of a certain age. Young kids get in trouble. They do stupid things. They sometimes end up horribly. But there are costs associated with that. And for this young man, there were no costs. He moved on with his life as if nothing had transpired. When we found the Edwin Williams file, there were 2 or 3 documents in the file. And my student, a young Irish-Canadian law student whose name was Erin, was assigned to investigate the case. And she called James Williams, the man I mentioned who was at the scene and was a child at the time. He's now 70, and he's the pastor of the same church. And Reverend Williams didn't want to talk. He said, I can't talk about this. And his wife called me the next day, and she said, you're re-traumatizing my husband. He cannot talk about this. And I told Erin she needed to persist, because this was a large family, and there was a way to get into that family and share with them what we had. And perhaps the most important thing we had was that affidavit from Lillian, that brave woman who the day after her husband is brutally killed, goes down, takes herself over to a New Orleans lawyer's office. That was the most valuable thing we had. And she does, Erin does. Ultimately, she reaches down to the next generation, James Williams' kids, and they are eager to find out about their grandfather and about the courage of the grandmother. So this is not dead history. This is living history. And ultimately, what we did in that case, the student, Erin, and the next generation down, these would be kids in their 40s, the full scope of African American life. Some have done fabulously. They're doctors and lawyers, others not so great. They all came together on Juneteenth this year in the beautiful Zion Baptist Church, the same church that couple was headed to on that Wednesday evening, and celebrated Lillian and Edwin and shared the truth. And the kids, the younger kids, the 40-year-olds, they said, we thought it was just a fight he got in that went bad. They knew nothing about the soldiers. They knew nothing about the beer bottle. Nothing about the way this young man was shipped off and then allowed to return home to Bexar, Texas, and live out the rest of his life. They knew none of it. And so it's all recent history. It's recent because actually, many of us remember the days, but it's all recent. It's recent as well because so much of it is still with us. I'm pretty much out of time here. I have more stories I could tell, but I want to open it up. Before I do that, I'd like to read the epilogue of the book. The book is about Jim Crow, and of course, as I moved around the country, folks will say to me, well, isn't that very much like what we are living in today? And I'm like, no, it's not, actually. It's not. You can't get knocked down or shot or blinded because you're on the wrong side of a color line in a bus today. No, it's not. And so we have to appreciate this history as history. Not that everything is as we would want it to be today, but to lop it all together and say, oh, police violence, we're living through that today. No. This was a different moment, and it has to be appreciated, and we can only live in our moment. We can only experience what we experience. But in order to understand what they experienced, that takes a little bit of study and a little bit of work. And so this epilogue does tie together two cases. After the murder of George Floyd by police in Minneapolis, Minnesota in 2020, a search of our archive of Jim Crow racial homicides revealed a striking but not shocking coincidence. A man of the same name was killed by a police officer in 1945. In October of that year, Thurgood Marshall received a letter from the secretary of the NAACP branch in St. Augustine, Florida, seeking an investigation into, quote, unquote, the untimely death of our brother George Floyd, whom we believe to have met his death unjustifiably so, close quote. 46 at the time of his death, the other George Floyd, a turpentine worker, was accused of being drunk on a Saturday evening and thrown into a cell in St. Augustine. Floyd's protest against the second invasive search at the jail so incensed the arresting officer that he beat Floyd to death in the presence of other detainees and the jailer. Just 2 documents have survived from which to render an accounting of this killing: the investigation of the branch NAACP and the Florida death certificate. Yet unmet at the time of this writing is the task of establishing true facts from these skimpy and contradictory papers. It was not entirely unforeseeable that we would find this named fellow in our archive, pleading to be exhumed and put in conversation with the iconic inspiration for what would become known as the 2020 reckoning with Black death at the hands of the state. After all, the Equal Justice Initiative identified more than 4,000 lynchings in the United States between 1877 and 1950. George Floyd's fate would not register in the EJI's report because it was not a lynching. One might ask whether counting is even worth the candle if X is not ascertainable. In this case, we count for Floyd number 1 and Floyd number 2. We count because George Floyd's younger brother beseeched the local NAACP to count. We count because the secretary of the branch wrote Thurgood Marshall and asked him to count. We count because George Floyd's paternal grandfather, Robert Floyd, was born into slavery in 1852, and with his paternal grandmother, also born a slave, had 8 children. We count because across 4 generations of Floyds, the men worked in the woods chopping down the towering longleaf pines that would build our country and tapping out the turpentine to seal the boards on the ships that would transport our nation's merchandise. And the women cleaned houses, raised children, ran make-do infirmaries, and took in laundry. We count because the Floyds' payday wages were their only asset, indebtedness their constant companion, and the perpetually incomplete project of slavery, their grinding geography. We count because day after day and year after year, George Floyd worked in a forest alongside convicts whom he was only nominally freer than, from can't see in the morning till can't see at night, dipping turpentine. We count because George and Rosa lived in the back of a camp that looked more like a prison, forbidden to keep a car on the premises because they might flee, and labored under the constant scrutiny of white bossmen, even when the work was done. We count the years of sweat and blood, never calculated, never compensated. We count the suffering of the living and the savagery of the dying. We count because we do not know who preached George Floyd's funeral, or where he is buried, or what happened to the man who killed him. We count and contest because George Floyd counted number 1 and number 2. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Sure. Happy to engage, folks.
Yes, one, thank you for doing such important work. And I wonder if you would clarify, was James Williams, was he so traumatized by his father's death 50 years that he was unable to deal with it? I'm not quite clear why he resisted that. And the other question is, I wonder if there are any examples a little closer to home. I'm sure there were plenty of enormities occurring in South Carolina.
Yeah, there are. We have cases from South Carolina in the archive, and I encourage people to check out the archive to find this, to look up the South Carolina cases. I was looking for cases for Charleston. I didn't this morning actually. I'm coming to Charleston, and I did find one or two, but I haven't used those. But they are, as these cases that I described, pretty illustrative. Thank you for the question about James Williams. And you know, our respondents have varied in the way they respond to our material, to this material. Some are, as I suggested earlier, eager to engage with us right away. They say, look, you know, nobody ever investigated this. What's going on? Once we publish the archive, you know, our website has been overwhelmed with people asking us to investigate X, Y, and Z cases. But for other folks, it's about moving on. You know, this man he's in his 70s now. He would have been, you know, maybe 2 or 3 when this thing happened back in 1943. And what he did tell me, I had a conversation with him early on when, after the conversation with my student, and he said to me, you know, my mother remarried. She had to raise a family, and it didn't work out. So it suggested to me that there was more trauma associated with the loss of his father than he wanted to actually go back to. And, you know, we have to make a decision at that point. Are we going to press on and try to find someone in that family who cares, or are we going to leave it alone? And when I first started this work, I would say, well, there's so many cases out there, I'll just leave this one alone. But now I tell the student, try to press on because there is someone who is going to care about this. And that's been our experience. And of course, I will say, you know, the student had a really tough time. A fabulous student, by the way, just a wonderful young woman, brilliant young. She's going to be a brilliant lawyer. But you know, I told her, I said, you're investigating the case of a man who died in 1943 in Louisiana named Edwin Williams. And she said, like, Williams? Like, what am I supposed to do with that? So it took her a really long time to get to this James Williams, who she found through Ancestry. Without Ancestry, we couldn't do this work. But she found him through Ancestry. She found his son through Ancestry. And then it's James Williams in Louisiana that she's looking for. And she finally, I don't know why she didn't think, let me just go back to the church and see if I can. Ultimately, she does. But you know, these are human relations and human reactions. And you know, we get the full range of folks who are anxious to engage and those who are not. If you go to our website, you'll see we have a video of that Juneteenth event, and James, the man James, is there, and at this point, he's fully engaged. I think you know, at one point, also, let me say in answer to your question, people think these are their personal tragedies. They don't see them as, you know, part of history. They don't see this as, you know, they just think, must have done something wrong, you know, for this to have happened. Cursed, whatever it is, they don't see this as part of an important part of our national history. And that's kind of why I wrote the book, is because I want to say that this too is us, folks. This is also us. You know, we're a great country, and you know, no one would want to live anywhere else. But this too is us.
I suspect that this has been growing in you for a long time. And the question is, I don't know what kind of judge you are or the judge who is. How did this affect your judgment as a judge? You know, these thoughts that you've grown older with them. It's got to affect you pretty severely in how you handle cases.
So that's a good question, and I'm teaching now. I'm not on the bench anymore. But the reason this is such, it's important history for, as I've said repeatedly, for its own sake. It's also critically important history for people who are going to come up in the law and are going to be lawyers or judges, because it's the history of the way those legal communities responded. And it just shows how easily this could be repeated. You know, these are fairly insular legal communities. They're all white communities. There's no black, you know, one or two black lawyers, no black judges, no black jurors, no black appellate judges, no black police officers. So you're dealing with a structure which is completely kind of internal to itself. And people take pride in their work. They want to be respected by their home communities. And they want to get invited to the neighbor's party and that sort of thing. And so I'm also looking at how this, you know, how if you have a system that is that racially insular, how it can pollute the law, how it can, you know, distort, not pollute, but certainly distort the law. One of the cases I trace involves a prosecutor from the Middle District of Alabama, is where Montgomery is located. And at the beginning of his career, he tries a race case involving a sheriff who kills a bunch of black folk. And he goes into the court to try this case. The courtroom is packed with police officers and sheriffs from across Alabama who come to be there for the defendant. He loses that case. The guy's name is Parker. Perfectly decent professional. He loses that case. He never tries another case. And in the book, I trace the cases that would then come before his district and the correspondence between him and the DOJ, the lawyers in Washington, to whom he's responsible. And each, you know, for each one of these cases, Parker says, no, I can't, I'm not going to do it. He knows he can't win them. So that you know, you have to keep that in mind too. Prosecutors only succeed in their profession by winning cases, not by losing cases. So, you know, once you start, it's a huge interconnected ball of wax. And I'm just pulling out one strand. I'm just pulling out a few strands here to, you know, throw the microscope up here and let's take a look at why this happened.
The reverse with Judge Waring. The reverse with Judge Waring here, where...
Of course. There were, but they were far and few between, which is why we celebrate them. And they paid dearly. They paid dearly for their courage.
That's the point.
We'll take a couple more questions before we continue the conversation at the back. We're going to personalize some books. They're also already signed books. One more question.
This is a question, really. It's, of course, thank you so much for doing all this research, putting all this information together, and going out on a limb.
Can I ask you to speak up a little bit?
I'm sorry. So thank you for doing all the research, pulling all this information together, and making it available for all of us to read. Thought that just came to mind is something that someone said to me yesterday, and that is when Harriet Tubman died, Ronald Reagan was 2 years old, and that wasn't that long ago. That wasn't that long ago. I feel like we forget that a lot of the incidents and events and discoveries, inventions, they didn't happen that long ago. It wasn't that long ago. And we just forget that.
Right. I mean, there's a lot of focus on slavery, and that's all good and well. But this is within our reach.
Oh, no, I wasn't.
No, I didn't really hear. I'm sorry. What was that question? I couldn't hear it.
Oh, she was just talking about, I think, the passage of time. I think is that it feels.
Yes.
It was interesting. I was kind of thinking the same thing, that the dates that you were speaking about.
Well, not that long ago.
Just not that long
Right,
ago.
thank you.
That we were either alive and young or our parents were actually alive and living
Yes.
in the communities where, so that it's truly not very long ago that we were
I got it.
directly connected to knowing, and one of the things that occurred to me, just to follow up on that, was how much did the communities know? You know, that idea of you kind of know, but you don't go deeper, and how many people, they knew something was going on. Some people knew a lot. Most people knew a little. That's, I think, part of the part that feels so, I'm going to say something powerfully shameful, that we're so deeply connected to it, but also hopeful because we are capable of making the changes, of now when we know a little, when we know a lot, we can now do something. There's something in our power to do, is to not ignore.
Thank you for that. Yes, the work is really about, it's for the families, and it's also for, as I said at the beginning, it's to put this work in the larger space of research, legal and historical research that is being done on this period, right? So I see myself in conversation with academics and others who are writing about this period.
Well, thank you. Thank you for the research. Thank you for the book. We invite you to, there are signed books, so you don't have to wait in line, but if you'd like to continue the conversation, Margaret Burnham will be in the back personalizing for a little bit, and thank you for being here.
Thank you, Paula.